It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Professor of Law at Fordham University and author of her latest, Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money, Zephyr Teachout. Welcome back to the program.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to talking.
So, all right. So Zephyr, we've had a lot of folks on this program over the past 4 or 5 years, talking about the idea of antitrust and of monopoly. And so my hope is that my audience knows this already, but I would like you just go through this remedial, the change that that took place in the I guess it was in the 70s and 80s, or was developing at least in the 70s and ultimately in the 80s, with the way that we perceive what antitrust and monopolies, why they are problematic and what we should do about them, just so that we can talk about the regime that we're living under now, at least.
Yep. So you're right that it's not a single moment, but let's just talk about it as 1980 for now, because Ronald Reagan and his crew came in with a wrecking ball. They came in with two big agendas. One was a not so veiled racist agenda, and the other was deregulatory. And the heart of their deregulatory agenda was just getting rid of our key anti-monopoly laws, redefining them, changing enforcement strategies. So when you think about some of the Reagan crew, thinking about Baxter coming in with, or Meese coming in with this double agenda to do whatever they could to undo the successes of the civil rights movement, and as the other part, to destroy antitrust. And the way they did it was by basically taking something that had been essential to public understanding, the idea that private power always has the potential for tyranny, that you get too much private power together and it forms a government in and of itself. And in the book, I try different analogies, like maybe we should think about this like the mafia, and we can talk about that more. But it's certainly an oligarchic form that's coexisting with our democratic form. And they stripped all that out and said, no, yeah, we do have anti-monopoly laws, we do have antitrust laws, but the only purpose of these laws is to make sure that consumer prices don't go up. So the only time we're going to stop a merger is if your toothpaste is going to get more expensive. And it's not that consumer price hadn't mattered before, it had, it's been important. But anti-monopoly law used to be about protecting against oligarchy, protecting workers, protecting communities, all of those things. And then the particular way that Reagan did it is by appointing hundreds of judges who reinterpreted these old laws like the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act to make it really hard to bring cases. And then by bringing in enforcers who said, oh, you have anti-monopoly laws, all we care about is consumer price. So then you might have hoped that Democrats, when back in power, would have said that was one of Reagan's big errors, but it's just the opposite. In fact, what you see is Clinton, the Bushes, but then also Obama sticking with this same model of consumer price is it. And in the meantime, what's happened is this, what I call a political revolution. I think we sometimes think about it too much in only economic terms, but it's a political revolution where just in the last decade, we've allowed 500,000 mergers globally. I mean, these numbers are incredible. And we're talking like Dow, DuPont, Walmart, and Bonobos, Amazon, and Whole Foods. And, you know, one of the things I really want to do is, and you guys have been great about talking about this, and I know this is something you care a lot about, but really shake the shoulders of progressives and say, okay, you think you know this. You think, oh yeah, I know there's a problem with corporate consolidation. But then look at your activism. Like, when is the last time you remember a rally in the streets of people demanding breaking up a big company? Well, Occupy Wall Street. Breaking up big banks was part of that. Well, that's been about a decade since then. think about the last time you asked a Congress member why she wasn't doing more work to break up any company, let alone your cable company, which I know you hate. It isn't, my bet is it isn't part of your politics because it hasn't been part of progressive politics. So if we're going to talk about power, and we have this crazy imbalance of power in our country, we've got to stop just playing at the margins. And yes, we need wealth taxes, but that's too modest. We need to actually go at the root issue and go at the power of these big corporations and break them apart at the root.
Okay, I want to put a pin in that because I think the way that you talk you talk about this in terms of activism and in terms of power versus policies, and there's I want to put a pin in that for a moment because I think one of the things that has sort of certainly grown over the past 10 years is sort of like the rise of the socialist or democratic socialist left, and much of what you're talking about, though maybe the prescriptive isn't there, but the analysis is similar, and so I want to come back to that in a bit, but just sticking with the change in the policy, just to be clear for people, the analogy I use is if the EPA was in charge of saying, we've got to keep harmful chemicals out of our water, they just basically redefined chemicals that are harmful from ones that give you cancer if you drink it once, from ones that give you cancer if you drink it for a year, essentially, right? I mean, it's a change in a
good analogy.
And so, okay, so we're there.
And just to underline that, it's a really powerful move because it took this thing that had been an essential part of our politics and basically said, whenever you're talking about that, you're wrong. So, the Grangers in the 19th century would shout down with monopolies, and people understood that being anti-monopoly was an essential part of politics. And now, and I experienced this in the Dodd-Frank fight, is that when you said, I want a new anti-monopoly policy, I want to break up banks because they have too much power, people said to me, oh, that's nice, but that's not anti-monopoly. Because if you're worried about power, that has been redefined out of what we think is at the heart of the anti-monopoly concern. And so people are left actually without words to describe this really threatening situation.
All right, so, I mean, just to be clear on that point too, that what you're saying is that when we think of monopoly, it's not just one big company. It has to do with having enough power as an entity, even if you have a rival, even if there's Amazon and Walmart, let's say, even if you have a rival, the point is that either one of them have an inordinate amount of power to impact not just the market, but the welfare of labor, the safety of consumers, or the ability for other competitors to join in. When we say monopoly, we're talking about a power dynamic as opposed to a threshold of size.
That's exactly right. And you can even listen to the neoliberal Milton Friedman, who described monopoly as a firm or company that basically had the power to set the terms. And so you'll often hear, we heard this in the most recent antitrust subcommittee hearings, Apple saying, oh, we're not a monopoly, we're not a problem because developers can go work for, develop apps for PlayStation. And they say, look, something else exists, therefore we can't be a monopoly. But everybody knows that Apple can basically set the terms of those interactions, and that developers have to pay up the 30% fee that Apple sets. They're not in a meaningful negotiation.
I have experienced that.
It's a really important shift. And one of the things I argue is, and again, this is an idea that was central in American history, is, once somebody sets the term, they're kind of a regulator. They're kind of a private regulator. Like what Apple is doing is a form of private taxation. What Amazon is doing is a form of private regulation. And these are not people you want to be regulating you.
I mean, I can, I've told this story before. We had an app, it's the Majority Report app. You listen to the show on there. You can links to YouTube. You can listen and you can listen to the member show or the free show. And we had a link. It was just a link in the app to our website to become a member. And Apple would not allow us to put that app on their store. That was the only problem they had, that we had a link to some way of making money secondary, right? I mean, it wasn't directly through the app. And so we had to keep the app on the store, we had to give them 30% of our memberships that come through the app. And that's just, it's a take it or leave it situation. And it's like, I'm sorry, 50-60% of our podcast listeners are on that platform. And so we have no choice. So let me ask you this, what changed?
And David Cicilline has called that highway robbery. And one of the things I want to recover is just an understanding that monopoly is a form of theft. I mean, these antitrust laws have criminal provisions in them, the old ones, because people understood that basically this is Apple just taking the value you're creating because they've created this choke point rule. They're not creating the value. They're just saying, hey, we're standing at the narrow point in the path and you want to get to the other side, pay up 30%.
And now, okay, and I want to get to I want to just hold that thought for one moment. But how did our culture change? I mean, because for a long time there was this sort of like hostility towards concentrated power in this country, and this understanding that like, it doesn't. I would prefer to pay 25% per membership to the government than 30% to Apple. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter to me who's taking that money. They're taking it from me to be able to do this business. And frankly, I would much prefer to give 35% to the government than I would 30% to Apple, because at least that goes to government services that, we can all enjoy. What changed in society in terms of this understanding? I mean, was it just downstream from these legal changes, or was it that people got bought off because they could get cheaper stuff?
I think it's a really complicated change story. I do think ideas matter a lot. And there was a rise in the Economics Academy that's still dominant, that really bought into these kind of satisfying, simple principles of the way the world works. At the same time, there's a lot of funding going into both the Economics Academy and in particular law and economics, so that there's big money funding institutes at various fancy colleges, so that people who study what they call law and economics but represents a particular ideological position rose up. And I do think those ideas matter. I do think people like cheap goods. And then the shake the shoulders part is, I think, a substantial part of the left really bought into the idea that the way to affect real meaningful change was to negotiate effectively with these big companies and use their role as consumers to basically change their behavior. And in some cases, it would work. And so you'd see these successful consumer rights, and the language of consumer rights efforts. And so people thought, well, I want to work with these big companies and use our consumer power. That works for a little while, but in the long term, it falls apart. And then there's another portion of the left that just sort of rejects the idea of markets altogether. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. I think markets, we can have moral markets. We don't right now, but that there's another part of the left that thinks, oh, if we're even talking about privately made stuff, I'm not even in this conversation. And I think that has been, I think it's wrong, but it's also been short-sighted. And I'm pretty progressive Democrat. I'm really excited about DSA and the DSA movement. And I think, as you were saying, one of the exciting shifts is that DSA has a vision of nationalizing things that we need to nationalize, but also trying to build a more coherent marketplace and not just saying we can't even talk about markets. I mean, what do you think? I think there's a real question mark around why we did this shift. And I'm interested in what you see as the big drivers.
I mean, to be honest with you, like I don't know. I think there has been over the past 30 or 40 years a cleave in people's understanding of their relationship with government and how what they do on every day impacts that. And I think as pressure increased, as wages started to stagnate, the idea of getting cheap goods became the most important dynamic of American life. And so it is harder to see those sort of second order implications of which ultimately become first order implications. But it's not as a direct relationship, right? Like it takes a while till you start to realize, like, hey, the fact that Walmart is giving me these cheap clothes, ultimately that's going to weaken labor strength. That's going to weaken the freedoms that producers have. It's going to weaken the opportunity for smaller firms to build their stuff. And that's a little bit obscured for the average person. I mean, I don't know that I would have awareness of it if I didn't, frankly, do this for a living. But I want to
say one more thing, because I miss the obvious point, which is I think that makes a lot of sense, especially for the shifts in the 70s. But the obvious point, which I failed to mention, is that as we changed the way that we fund elections, we saw fewer and fewer candidates who wanted to bite the hand that feeds them on this. I mean, this is a very much a money in politics story too. And so I think that story makes sense for the early days, but it's not like people were cheering on mergers. They just felt kind of agnostic about them.
Right.
And then you suddenly turn around and say, hey, wait a second. Now we're in this crazily concentrated arena. But I do think money in politics is part of it, and part of the rise of the new anti-monopoly movement is because you have more and more candidates who are freed from that cycle. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the leaders in Congress are people who are not relying on big money donations.
Right. I think that's a really important point for people to be conscious of. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this concept of there being essentially, when we have monopolies of this size, what we're getting is almost a parallel government. It's just a private government. And I want to start with arbitration, because one of the central elements, I mean, talking to a law professor of a society and of a government, is that there is a legal system which allows for redress. We're talking about the civil system here, so that if I am harmed by someone else, I can go to court, and that's being narrowed in many respects by conservative justices. But be that as it may, I can go to court and I can seek redress. I can get a resolution on a contract. I can get resolution on a harm that's been done for me. And what has happened with this concentration of power is that there has been essentially created a parallel system, legal system, if you will, of resolving conflict that is been fully privatized. And that is, of course, arbitration. Tell us about that dynamic and how this new phenomena started. And frankly, it involves Antonin Scalia.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the craziest, most audacious revolutions in American political structures. In the 60s and 70s, Congress passed a series of really important civil rights laws. Think Americans with disabilities, anti-discrimination laws for age, gender, race, workplace rights laws. And one thing that you might imagine big companies would do, because suddenly there were all these cases, and these cases were coming into court, and there were a lot of stories being told. So one thing you might think these big companies would do would go and say, let's overturn these civil rights laws. But they did something so much more audacious, which is they started developing the this technique of asking both consumers and employees to sign contracts when they enter into either the consumer arrangement or the employment arrangement. And I really focus on the employment arrangement because I think that's where it's the most egregious, although there's plenty of bad in consumer. To say, well, we're entering into a relationship. If we end up having any kind of dispute, you agree to waive your right to a judge who is paid by the public. Instead, you will have a privately paid for judge. And by the way, in practice, that's going to be privately paid for by the big corporation. Instead of having an open court, you waive your right to openness and all the proceedings will be secret. Instead of your right to a jury, that's gone. You contractually agree to get rid of rules of evidence and the right to appeal. And in a series of cases, the Supreme Court took on challenges to corporations doing this, which said, hey, wait, it's okay in the certain circumstances when there's two businesses negotiating with each other, or a marriage is falling apart, you might want to go through mediation. There's certain circumstances where you can contract away those rights, but you shouldn't be allowed to enter into a contract before the claim has even arisen when it comes to routine consumer or civil rights claims cases. And the courts just, in case after case, said, nope, you contracted to it, nope, you contracted to it, nope, you contracted to it. And it allowed these big corporations to set up this private legal regime. Now, in practice, if you get discriminated against now, you theoretically have the right to arbitration, but very few lawyers are going to take your case because the rewards are capped. So in practice, this was a way of getting rid of those essential laws. They're just disappearing from the courts. And I think it's a total scandal. And it's based on this fantasy of choice. Can you imagine being a 25-year-old getting a job at McDonald's, and you've just got your job and you've got maybe a couple $100 in savings, and you say, I love the job, I need the job, but by the way, later you're going to discriminate against me and I want to make sure I can go to open court, so I'm not going to sign this arbitration clause. That just doesn't happen.
I mean, I click on I agree to the terms of a contract, I don't know, twice a day online. I'm not even going to contemplate it. And because I need the access to this stuff, I'm doing my work. And the idea, well, I mean, it seems, and I have to say that I think your book, tying in this notion of essentially a private government with arbitration, it's almost as if what's being asked is opt out of society. You're going to enter into another society. I mean, it's like, look, we don't have the choice as to whether we can allow for children to work 16-hour days. And, a child obviously is too young to give their consent, but I can't go to someone's parent and say, hey, you're their legal guardian. You have the ability to sign documents for them. Let's make a contract where your kid works for me 18 hours a day. Not allowed to do that. And in this instance, in some ways, basically, this is allowing people to opt out of our society that has decided there are certain protections for people. And you move into this sort of netherworld where these protections don't exist in that way. And then, of course, the dynamic is completely weighted on behalf of the power.
It really is and there were some people howling in the wilderness about this when it happened. Owen Fiss, who's a professor at Yale, was saying, wait a second, that this is basically a form of, let's contractually signing away your First Amendment rights, contractually signing away these core rights to an open court. And the courts have elevated contract law over our constitutional rights. It's like contract beats everything. Now, the good news on arbitration is this is one where we can get rid of as a no-brainer if we get it past the Senate. It actually, an important bill to end this has passed the House. So it's an area where serious political action and the right people in the Senate can actually make a difference. But it's really dark. I think it's literally dark because we don't see. And one of the things you see when you're looking back at the 80s and 90s and how big businesses were talking about it is it's not so much that they didn't want to have to pay up when somebody slipped and fell. It's they didn't want these stories out there. I mean, this is one of the functions of court is we actually get to look inside and find out what's actually happening. And I mean, if we got rid of arbitration clauses, the Amazon stories we'd hear from sellers and employees would be so much worse than what we're hearing now.
Well, longtime listeners of the program know that I, in non-pandemic times, I go to Vegas twice a year for a torts conference. And what invariably comes out of the stories I hear, there are stories of settlements that are done where people, I encourage people to go and look at the story of the most popular Remington rifle in the country, and how Remington knew for years that it fired by itself and had killed multiple people, but they were able to keep it quiet through settlements and basically keeping this out of the public eye. And so it's a major problem. Well, let's move on to give some examples of how this dynamic works. And I want to just sort of make sure that we keep in the forefront the idea of that choke point that we were talking about in the context of Apple. Because there are people out there who say, well, Apple created not just the choke point, but they created the pipeline, as it were. And so therefore why can't they have the right to choose where they choke it? And let's talk about in the context of that term chickenization that I know that you borrowed. Tell us what chickenization is, and we can talk about this maybe in the context of agricultural business.
Yeah, I got the term chickenization from great reporting by Chris Leonard in his book, The Meat Racket, and Chris is also a friend. And what chickenization is it's the term used by the beef and pork industry to describe how they are starting, now they're doing it. They imitated what was happening in the chicken industry. And what is happening in the chicken industry is a handful of distributors, think Tyson or Pilgrim's, Purdue, have gobbled up all the other local distributors and then have also bought related companies like feed services, the hatcheries for getting the eggs, the consulting services. They bought up all these different related industries. And then they say, okay, we are going to allow you, chicken farmer, to get your food to market. And if you look at it from a distance, it looks like, there are thousands of independent businesses. They look independent. They take out their own mortgage. They looks like they're making their own decisions. But then Tyson says, okay, we'll take your chicken to market, but only if you use our feed and all of our ancillary services. Otherwise, nice job having a business, but you're going to go bankrupt. So, of course, the farmers have to agree. But then it gets much worse than that. They also require them to sign contracts, of course, arbitration contracts, but contracts that say they can't even talk to their neighbors and that they may get paid different amounts every month. And they're told they're getting paid different amounts because of the productivity of their chickens, but they don't really have any way of checking on it. And then there's a lot of stories from farmers, and I talk to farmers about fear of retaliation when they speak out about the problems in the system. So that if you speak out about what Tyson is doing, and in 2010, Obama's Justice Department held hearings on this, if you speak out at some of these hearings, you're actually going to get worse inputs and you may end up going bankrupt. And so what this leads to, and what the reason I tell this story is because it leads to a state of rational paranoia where you can't talk with anybody. You look free, but you're not free. You're in a state of total precarity. And Tyson can then experiment on you, giving you some feed and somebody else some feed, and you won't know. So you're basically subject to their regime, and your political voice is also silenced. Well, Amazon sellers are in the same relationship to Amazon as chicken farmers are to Tyson. Uber drivers are in the same relationship to Uber. Like, across society, this is now the model we have, and it's certainly not an open market, and it's a really coercive one, but it leads to such humiliation. Like, I really just want to talk about what this does to us as humans to be in this kind of relationship.
Please.
What it does is it makes people fearful. Fearful to speak out about the things they know the most about. It kills a kind of a community where you're talking to other chicken farmers. Maybe you hate them, maybe you love them, but you're all kind of in this industry together. And it leads to this just constant state of instability and fear, not just about your wages, but about whether you can continue working. And I think once we can see that, and we can make the political connections between two communities that have often seen each other as antagonists, workers and small business owners, rural people working in rural communities, people in urban communities, and see that these connections are greater than what divides us, and take on the shared enemy of concentrated power, that there's a real potential for powerful political action. Another group that really easily falls into this category is franchisees. Franchisees are overwhelmingly represented by people of color who often don't have access to capital in the same way. They also have the same relationship to, say, McDonald's as a chicken farmer does to Tyson's. They're really controlled, but they look free. So it's a really disconcerting position to be in.
Let's talk a little bit about how how this market concentration overlaps with racial disparities. Speak to that.
Yeah, I think people sometimes think about anti-monopoly or antitrust as racially neutral, which it most definitely is not. In fact, when you see concentrated power, it's almost always white power. And people of color are far more likely to own small businesses than run a Fortune 500 company. So think about it in particular industries like the funeral home industry, which has traditionally been a really important location for Black political power. That decentralized industry, through mergers, has effectively gotten bleached out and is now controlled by conglomerates. So one of the thought experiments I go through is, okay, so imagine the civil rights movement today and look at where a lot of the centers of power were. Independent Black pharmacists, independent car owners, Black car owners, funeral homes, Black newspapers, Black-owned insurance companies. Those have all been wiped out through mergers. So just as the CARES Act may look racially neutral, but was not in fact, we're seeing the total destruction of Black-owned businesses. Well, private equity is thriving. The antitrust is not race neutral at all. In fact, it's a form of politics, and it's a form of politics that increases white political power. That's not the only dynamic, but it's a key one that I think is really important to talk about.
I mean, it basically feels like a subset of it increases to the extent that there are disparities. It enhances those because those with power get more power. Those who have marginal power or less power lose it. I mean, this is a largely a rich get richer, poor get poorer type of dynamic.
It's that, and then sometimes you see things like, if you see it as a form of politics, and you can also see the ways in which, like, who is funding ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which I'm sure you've talked about on the show. After some successful protests, a handful of big companies left. But when ALEC was pushing its voter suppression laws in North Carolina and elsewhere, in the in the last decade, it was getting funded by Google. It's still getting probably funded by your phone company now. And basically that there's this bargain that gets made between these big companies and political leaders who want to fan the flames of flames of racial division. And that bargain entrenches power, but the cost is enormous because, of course, the politicians that ALEC was backing, that's Tom Tillis.
Right.
There's like the long-term, when Tom Tillis was rising, Google was backing ALEC, which was backing Tom Tillis. So the long-term racial cost of these concentrations of power is enormous.
I'm so old. I remember when they used to use "Don't be evil" as their slogan, I guess, their company marketing scam. All right. Well, so let's talk about, what, and you focus largely in your book on this notion of, what kind of activism we need to see, and really in many respects, we need to look at this structurally, as opposed to on a policy by policy basis, and really push. So, I mean, talk a little bit more about that, and then, but also, what are the key things? Because you're basically saying, activists need to take a sort of like a 20,000 foot view of this to change a broader regime, and then the sort of the pieces of that regime will be filtered in. But give us a notion of what that looks like.
Yeah. So the first step, which is so basic, is don't be intimidated. Like, if there's concentrations of power, trust yourself. Don't go running to check with a professional economist if you're right about the particulars of a market structure. We need to repoliticize this. And I think that's a really important first step.
Repoliticize it as opposed to make it about technocrats and them saying, you just don't understand how this all works, type of thing.
Yeah. And the obvious comparison is like tax policy. Activists don't say, well, I want to raise, I think we should raise taxes on big corporations, but I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to incorporate it into everything I do. And you incorporate it into everything you do. Even if you're focused on something else, you might constantly say, hey, we've got a tax problem here. And they don't say that about labor, but they do about antitrust. Like, there's this sort of instinct of, I obviously there's a concentration of power problem, but it's like, let me run to an expert before I say something. Just incorporate it. It's true. It's true. So just trust yourself. Second, I think it's key. I know one politician, Ron Kim in New York, who calls himself an anti-monopolist. But you know what? Most candidates never get asked about it. So make it part of the process when you're talking to candidates, when you're at events. So if you're talking about drug policy, or you're talking about big tech, or say, well, where do you stand on breaking them up? Make it, and it's that start. I mean, the exciting thing is, you've been talking about this for a while. I've been talking about this for a while. We are at an inflection point. This is starting to happen. But what we have not seen is big break them up political actions. Where, and Athena is probably the closest to that. There's a new group called Athena that is bringing together labor and small businesses and progressive groups to fight against Amazon's abuses. And they think Amazon needs to be broken up, and that's pretty exciting. But, the closest we got was tens of thousands of people, or I think close to 1 million people, actually, it was pretty big, signing a petition, an online petition against the Monsanto-Bayer merger. That's the closest we got. People aren't doing sit-ins at the FTC. They're not holding big events outside Chuck Schumer's office saying, hey, as Senate Majority Leader, do more about this, hold more hearings. So, there are particular ideas, but my basic challenge is, if you think you care about this but haven't made it part of your politics, it's a little bit like saying I care about money in politics, but haven't made it part of my politics, which was true for a long time, and I think that's changed. So that's really what I'm pushing for. And the truth is, the more you're at 20,000 feet, the easier it is, because then it's not actually about particular industries, though I think we may need different responses in different industries. It's just bringing a power lens to bear. And the big shift is moving from corporate accountability to corporate illegitimacy. And we've been in a corporate accountability model for decades now, which is we've got to make this big corporation act better, maybe through boycotts, maybe through going to Congress, but it's always been, we assume you exist, be better, instead of, you shouldn't exist anymore. Amazon, you can be a marketplace, but you can't also own the warehouses. Google, you can be a search, but you can't also own Google Flights. And just, we're done. Not be nicer in the way that you prefer Google Flights over their competitors.
The interesting, sort of like a parallel I see to this is that, the argument for full-on socialism is to diminish the ability of the capitalist class to sort of claw back on gains that might be made with reforms. But on some level, that is also, and it is obviously this is distinct in many respects, but that is part of the argument that you're making too, is that we can fight for $15 an hour, but we could also diminish the power of corporations to make that to make it that we have to fight so hard for $15 an hour.
That's absolutely right. And actually, when it comes to minimum wage, one of the things I think we got to be very careful is we fight for a minimum wage, but we shouldn't treat it like it's a maximum wage. Like that's not our goal. We need much greater power equilibrium than we currently have now. And I don't think we get there without breaking up these big corporations, or in some cases nationalizing them. I mean, I think sometimes people have this idea that either you're an anti-monopolist or you're a democratic socialist or socialist. And the truth is there's two anti-monopoly traditions in our country. There's a strong socialist anti-monopoly tradition in the late 19th century, which was very much focused on workers taking over control of the means of production. And then a strong, more Brandeisian anti-monopoly movement in the beginning of the 20th century. And I'm being a little simple about that, but these both exist. And so I think it's important to understand that wherever you want to go, you can't get there from here unless you go through and basically stop Amazon's stranglehold, stop Bayer, which now owns Monsanto's stranglehold, stop Walmart's or Apple's. Like, otherwise, we're just going to be constantly playing a game, trying to get a few scraps here and there. And by the way, they're pretty clear that they want to govern us. They're not. Once you really listen to their words, they do think they're smarter than everybody. They're like technocrats in that way, except they're technocrats with an enormous amount of money, most of which they got by standing in this choke point position.
Brandeis himself wrote about antitrust. What would you read? What would you recommend people read if they're interested in that late 19th century antitrust movement that was more based in also a socialist worldview?
Oh, it's a great question. Who's a good chronicler of that right now? I may have to get back to you on that.
I'll do. We do it we do the show every day. And well, I mean, I mean, to a certain extent, one of the things that I perceived as it was a strength of Elizabeth Warren's candidacy was that it is her view of anti-monopoly represented a step that must be taken regardless of how far down the road you want to go in stripping corporate power in this country. And that is start by, sort of leveling the playing field. And I think that is, that's one of the things I think that your book shows, is that this is a great first step in diminishing the power of corporations to prevent further reforms, frankly, because this is as much about politics as it is about, there is no delineation in terms of what these corporations seek. And it's funny, and at some level, Donald Trump represents this perspective of like, these corporations perceive government as a tool in which to enrich themselves, and they perceive government power within our society as a tool to enrich themselves, and so they're inextricably linked.
Yeah, no, I mean one of the I think Warren's contribution was great. It's one of these areas where there's interesting bedfellows. I'm pretty far to the left of Klobuchar, but Klobuchar has been out front, an incredible leader on anti-monopoly, because she sees the way it's destroying farming communities. And so, as you say, like if wherever you want to go, you may have to go through here. One of the things I think we all need to do more work on is just showing how much it is a central driver of inequality. Like there's great recent research showing what I think people intuitively feel, but that consolidation may have led to $14,000 a year going from workers to investors because of relative bargaining power. Basically, once you only have a few companies, workers just basically have to live with the scraps. And so that money is then going to investors and is driving inequality. And Lena Khan, who's a brilliant scholar and actually was my policy director for my 2014 gubernatorial campaign before she went on to become a superstar in anti-monopoly, has written some wonderful pieces about inequality and anti-monopoly. And like, if we're going to address inequality, let's look at the before the fact power structures that lead to it, and not just tax after the fact.
Zephyr Teachout, the book is Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. We could have done this for another hour, but I encourage people to read the book. We've linked it at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. Great stuff. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.
All right, folks.